Hi, welcome to this video about the Herzlich Labs OMEN dual passive resonant low pass gate. Dual because it has two channels that you can use separately or linked. Passive because it does not require external power. And resonant because the low pass, well, not filters, but the low pass gates are resonant. And if all of this sounds like utter witchcraft to you, I think you should watch the video because OMEN is really a magical device. And of course, I want to thank LB from Herzlich Labs for sending me this unit so I can make a video about it. Let's first run you through what's happening here. The top trace, the blue one on data, is the signal that I'm sending into the input of OMEN. In this case, it's just a saw wave coming from even VCO. The second trace on data is what I will be using to send into the CV input of OMEN. And this will cause the low-pass gate to open and close. Then the bottom trace on data, the yellow line, is the signal that I'm extracting from the output of OMEN. And it's this yellow signal that's routed through to my mixer. And obviously at this point we're not hearing anything. And this is because there's nothing going into the CV input on OMEN. Currently I've connected a manual offset coming from maths. And let me bring it up. And you can hear and see that the low-pass gate does not immediately open when I send in some voltage. It needs a few volts, I guess it's 2 volts, to start opening up. And from other low-pass gates by other manufacturers, I know this has something to do with reducing channel bleed between the two channels of the low-pass gate. Now when I turn the offset, which is 10 volts right now, 1 square on data represents 5 volts. And you can see that even though OMEN is passive, it's not connected to the power supply in any way. You can see that the amplitude of the sound that I'm getting out of it is not lower than the sound that I'm sending in. You can also see that when I start closing down the low-pass gate by reducing the voltage that I'm sending into the CV input, that the amplitude of the output drops. And the saw gets a little bit rounded off. Now it's easier to see when I turn up the frequency of my VCO. So now you can see that the saw wave that we're getting out of OMEN, the red cable, the yellow trace, is getting a little bit rounded off if you reduce the voltage that you are sending into the low-pass gate. Each channel of OMEN has a switch which determines the character of the low-pass gate. The center position marked with the empty triangle is the most resonant and brightest setting. Then there's the left setting, which is a filled-in triangle. It's the dullest setting, the least sharp setting. And then when we flick this switch to the right, it's something in between. Now the beauty of low-pass gates is that you can send in a gate signal or even a short trigger like I'm doing now. And you won't get any of the clicks and pops that you can expect when you're just using a VCA to attenuate a sound by just sending a gate or trigger into the CV input. In a low-pass gate, all the edges are rounded off. And there's also a little bit of a decay that's natural for a low-pass gate. And this feature of low-pass gates makes it very useful because you don't need a separate VCA and envelope module to attenuate a sound. And I keep saying sound, but you can even send CV voltages through and attenuate them with whatever you want, really. But I will show that a little bit later in the video. So the gate I'm sending in right now is a really short gate. It's really just a trigger. But if I increase the width, you can hear that this influences the sound a little bit, because now the low pass gate has a little bit more time to fully open. Let me narrow the gate again. The knobs here for every channel attenuate the signal that we're sending into the CV input, and this results in the sound getting, well, it sounds like it's getting more and more filtered when you attenuate it. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, but we attenuate the CV signal by turning this knob to the right. And you can hear at this setting that the low pass gate is not fully opening. Let's try this with the switch to the left. Let me widen the gate again. And instead of a saw wave from even VCO, let's take a saw wave coming from generate 3. And if I change out my trigger to a DC offset again, here you can clearly see that the sound we're getting out of Omen is a rounded version of the saw wave we are sending in. And let me flick the switch to the center position. You can also hear that this is a lot more resonant. And when I turn down the voltage that I'm sending in, we're again getting those rounded curves. With the switch in the right position, like I said, it's something in between the brightest and the dullest setting. Let's watch what it does to a square wave. And even with a square wave, we're getting some resonance out of Omen. Let me flick it to the center or brightest position. And you can clearly see that the amplitude of the output is not lower than the amplitude of the input. In fact, it's even a little bit louder. But now let's listen to the second channel of Omen, which has a little bit of a different character to it. And I have to turn down my volume here. You can see how the second channel of Omen has a really gnarly resonance to it. And of course, if we turn down the voltage that we are sending in. We again get those rounded shapes. Let's try the second channel in the least bright setting with the switch to the left. And even then we're getting those resonant spikes. And on the middle setting, which is confusingly the right setting of the switch, we're also getting that resonance. Let's send in the short trigger again, or gate. Actually, it's still at a wider setting. Let me narrow it down. Let me tune down my VCO. And of course, you don't need to stick to static voltages or triggers. You can just as well send in an LFO. It's worth to note when you're sending in a bipolar CV signal, the part of the signal that's going below 0 won't have any effect. Low pass gate really expects positive voltages to open. So let's switch over to a unipolar LFO. Let's try a sample and hold. And that's enough of that. Now let's listen to what the two channels chained together sounds like. So for this, I'm just going to send a signal. Let me switch back to a saw wave from even VCO. So I'm sending that saw wave into the input of the first channel. For now, I'll use a trigger. I'll send this trigger into the first CV input, but the two channels are normalized together. So we can use the output of the second channel to monitor our sound. And the sound is going through both low pass gates, and it just uses the CV signal we're sending into the first channel for the second channel as well. And by the way, you can monitor the activity of the CV input here. And when you attenuate the CV signal with the knob, you can see the effect of that attenuation by watching the LED as well. So let's widen my trigger, make it a gate. Let's tune up my VCO. And in fact, let's switch over to the manual offset again. And you can now see once again that the amplitude of the signal that we're getting out of Omen really isn't lower than the amplitude of the signal we are sending in. In fact, it's a lot more resonant and it's just louder. And if I turn down the manual offset, you can get those rounded shapes as well. What you can additionally do in this mode is sending a different signal into the second CV input. Let's use the unipolar sample and hold for this again. And let's change out the manual offset to the triggers again. So right now the first channel is being triggered by a short gate which opens the low pass gate, or at least the first segment of it. And then the sound is going through the second part, or the second channel of the low pass gate, and this is being opened and closed by a sample and hold. So this changes the timbre of the sound that we're getting out of Omen. Let me widen my gate a lot so we can actually hear those changes to the timbre. And let's switch over to a sine wave to modulate the second channel. Let's slow it down a bit. So you can see here by watching the LED, the gate I'm sending in to open and close the first channel. And then on the bottom channel you can watch the LED, which monitors the activity at the CV input, which I now changed to a bipolar sine wave LFO. Of course, instead of sending in just a trigger or gate to open and close our sound, we can send in an envelope like you would with a regular VCA. Let me zoom out a bit on the scope. Let's remove the sine wave, modulating the second channel. So now the envelope we're sending into the first channel, which is still the red trace on data, is also used for the second channel. And this is just because of the internal normalizations. And when I now send in a bipolar LFO into the second channel, let me increase the speed drastically. Now to change things up, let's send in a triangle wave into the input. We're still using an envelope to open and close the low pass gates. Let's switch back to using just a gate to open and close the low pass gates. Let me again narrow down the gate so it's more of a trigger. And instead of sending in audio rate oscillations, you can just as well send in LFO rate oscillations. Like right now, I'm just sending in a sample and hold LFO into the input. I'm sending a trigger into the CV input. The two channels are linked or chained, and what we're getting out of it are just pops and crackles. Now let's once again change our input signal to something with a lot of transients. So a high-tuned signal with a lot of harmonics. And let's increase the speed of the triggers. And reduce the width even more. And by the way, you can change the character of the separate low-pass gates when they are linked as well. And this of course increases the variety of sounds that we can get out of Omen. And instead of this fast trigger train, let's send in a really fast unipolar sample and hold. And let's play around a bit with the tuning of my VCO. And now, instead of sending in an audio rate oscillation into the input, let's send a bipolar sample and hold LFO into the input. And let's trigger the low-pass gate with a short gate again. Let's increase the width a little bit, and let's turn down the speed again. And if I then zoom out on the scope, you will be able to see that the LFO that we are sending in is actually getting through whenever the low-pass gate is triggered. And it takes some time for the low-pass gate to fully close, especially for those low frequencies. And we can use this to kind of ping modulation. So to demonstrate that, I'll use the signal coming out of Omen, which is the yellow trace, to modulate a filter. Let's send the saw wave of even VCO into the input of this filter. And then we'll just listen to the output of the filter, which is getting modulated by the output of Omen, which is just a low-pass gated version of a sample and hold LFO that we are sending in. The LFO that I'm sending into the input is a bipolar oscillation, just like the VCOs that I was sending in were bipolar. And then of course you can go haywire by sending in different triggers into the second channel of the low-pass gate. Let's switch over to a triangle LFO. It's maybe a little bit clearer to see what's happening. Let's remove the trigger, going into the second channel again. I think this is very surprising, at least if you're not familiar with low-pass gates, and very useful to be able to ping modulation like this. That's really cool. Anyway, this is going to be it for this video about OMEN by Herzlich Labs. Have a look at the other stuff that LB is making. I'll put a link to his reverb shop in the description box. He makes really interesting things. A lot of them are passive. He also makes these 0 HP little module expanders. I don't know how to call them. For example, there's a little attenuator that you can just plug between two cables. Those things don't take up any rack space, but they are very useful indeed. I hope you learned something in this video. Thank you very much for watching. Bye!